We're living in strange times, let's just admit it. You may have heard about the two elderly ladies. Excuse me, I realize in these postmodern times with postmodern sensitivities, you can't say that. You may have heard of the two chronologically advanced females who were driving along on a highway, and they were pulled over by a police officer, and the state trooper went up to the window and started speaking to the chronologically advanced female driver. And he said to her, he said, "Ma'am, do you have any idea how fast you have been going?" And she said, "Yes, sir, I'm very fastidious about these things. I was going 20 miles an hour. He said, "Yes, I know you're going 20 miles an hour. That's why I pulled you over. This is the interstate highway system. And on the interstate highway system, the minimum speed is 35 miles an hour, 45 in most places, and you have, well, you failed by driving too slowly." Just then he looked in and he saw the other chronologically advantaged female who was the passenger. Her eyes were wide open like saucers. Her hair was sticking out at end. Her fingers were embedded in the dashboard of the car. She didn't even appear to be breathing. The officer said, "What's wrong with her?" The lady said, "You said this is an interstate highway." "Yes, ma'am." "I distinctly saw the sign 20 miles an hour." He said, "No, ma'am, this is Interstate 20. He said, "But what's wrong with your sister?" She said, "Well, I guess the best way to explain this is we must have gotten on Interstate 20 off of State Road 136. Now, that's where a lot of us live. We're living at 136, not at 20. And we're living at one of these hinge points in human history when we know that big things are changing. Seismic shifts are taking place all around us that are changing the landscape, the terrain of what is known and what is familiar. And we have labels we try to use for this, such as postmodern. You know, the very fact that we use that label requires some kind of definition, and it is helpful always for us to try to put some fabric to the texture of what we're talking about here. It means after the modern. Now, that solves it. Postmodernism is one of these awkward topics and frameworks of discussion because it is so ill-defined. There is a sense in which modernity, associated with the Enlightenment, with the rise of industrialization, the rise of science, and the rise of the logic and the gestalt of human control and huge theory, we understand that there was such a time, and we understand that there is now a disillusionment about that time. We understand that we no longer have the confidence that people as a culture once had in technology. But then again, we really do still have much of that confidence. And we understand that there was the death of the idea of progress early in the 20th century. If nothing else, the killing fields of World War I brought to an end the kind of unrealistic optimism that was at the very heart of the early phase of modernity. We understand that the Enlightenment, in terms of its massive philosophical shifts, did not bring about the kind of human liberation that it had promised. And yet we still want modern medicine, not postmodern medicine. Most of us want decidedly modernist bankers, not postmodern bankers, and we're going to talk about why that is so. I want to talk about several features of whatever postmodernism is. The first feature is the deconstruction of truth. Throughout most of human history, people argued about the nature of truth and which proposition was true, not whether truth can be known. The Christian tradition understands truth is established by God and revealed through the self-revelation of God in Scripture. Truth is eternal, fixed, and universal. Our responsibility as Christians, we understand, is to align our minds with the truth revealed by a self-existent God. That is so foreign to the concept of postmodernism. As postmodernist philosopher Richard Rorty asserts, truth is made rather than found. You just think about that equation for a few moments, and it begins to make sense when you consider much of the entertainment, much of the conversation, much of what we hear around us. Truth is made, not found. The idea that truth is socially constructed is at the very heart of postmodernism. That truth claims are disguised claims to power. that claims to truth are actually exercises in the majority seeking to suppress the minority, in the empire seeking to suppress the colony, in the majority seeking to isolate, to subjugate, to oppress. And that's why you come across all the jargon of postmodernism with its totalitarian claims of oppression, with its hegemonistic language. Michel Foucault, one of the most significant postmodern theorists, argued that all claims to truth are constructed in order to serve those in power. Then you understand why the great project of liberation will be deconstruction. If what is presented as truth is constructed in order to oppress people, then liberation comes in deconstructing those truth claims. And so in the West, especially in the universities and the academy, we've seen this project of trying to deconstruct the big issues, the big frameworks, the big claims of Western civilization. Christianity very much at the heart of that. If all truth is socially constructed, then all truth is necessarily relative to whoever's doing that constructing. Whatever society does the constructing, whatever unit or subgroup of society does the constructing, it's merely a relative claim. Little imagination is needed to see that this radical relativism is a direct challenge to the Christian gospel. Secondly, the death of the meta-narrative. Now, this is take-home stuff. This is the kind of stuff I'm sure you're talking about in your dinner table every night. You know, what are you concerned about, sweetheart? The death of the meta-narrative. Striking at the very core of my existence. Well, it would if you understood it. If you understood the claim that's being made here, postmodernists accuse the oppressors of using a specific mechanism of oppression, which is the meta-narrative. That's the explanatory theory of virtually everything. It's the big story. And examples of meta-narratives would include Marxism. Marxism was perhaps the greatest intellectual and spiritual challenge to Christianity as a meta-narrative for about 100 years. Marxism has everything. It has a complete worldview. It has an explanation of what we would call sin. It's oppression. It has an explanation of why inequity exists. It's because of the oppression of the proletariat. It has an explanation for eschatology. What is it looking forward to? The emergence of the new communist man. It had everything. Christianity, of course, is a meta-narrative. It explains why anything exists. Christianity has an answer for what it means. Christianity has an explanation for what is broken. Christianity has an explanation for how it can be fixed. Christianity has an eschatology. Meta-narratives would include the Western confidence in progress that did die early in the 20th century. Technology is itself, in its own form, a meta-narrative that all problems can be solved by technology or by modern science. What we have, according to the postmodernists now, is the death of all the meta-narratives. Jean-François Lyotard, one of the most prominent of the postmodern theorists, explains postmodernism as simply this. He says, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. The big story's dead. Now, again, as an apologetic challenge for Christianity, it's hard to find one more significant than this. If the meta-narrative is dead, then all we're left with, rather than the big story of the Christian gospel, is little stories. And these little stories have to do with, well, here's my truth, and you have your truth. This group has its truth. This group has another truth. The third hallmark is the demise of the text. There's been a lot of work done recently on Christianity and the book. 3 or 4 excellent monographs, books that have come out just in the last several months on Christianity and the book, indicating that, again, the very emergence of the book as we know it, as a text, a codex between covers, was very much due to the Christian love of learning and to the Christian desire to communicate in rational form, in literary form, the kind of conversation that would go on not only between individuals but between centuries. And you know, we believe that the text is an objective thing. But postmodernists suggest that the text is actually there to be dissected. The text itself is dead because the author is dead. The reader now establishes the meaning, and no controls limit the meaning of the reading. Jacques Derrida the leading literary deconstructionist, described this move in terms of what he called the death of the author. So we look at a text now and we say, well, it doesn't really matter what the author meant. It only matters what now I mean, what I read out of this text. Now, before we start looking at the academic left and saying, oh, how prone to postmodernism you are, let's look a little closer to home. How many evangelical Bible studies are postmodern in this sense? You get a bunch of evangelicals and they're sitting in church or they're sitting in a home and they each have a Bible on the lap and they're sitting around in a circle. Bill, why don't you read this verse? Bill reads the verse. All right, Bill, what does this mean to you? Well, what this text means to me is having absolutely nothing to do with the text. Well, let's go around the circle and see what it means. Sheila, what does it mean to you? Chad, you ever been in one of those things and you just want to stand up, rip your clothes, and say, I love you, I care about you, but I don't care what this text means to you. I care what this text means. See, we're living a lot closer to this than we'd like to admit. Texts, according to the postmodernists, reveal a subtext of oppression. And again, what must be done is deconstruction. You have to deconstruct the text. And so you have to find things there that were never there. If you want tenure in a major university, do not write your dissertation on Romeo and Juliet in terms of actually trying to deal with the text. Write about Romeo and Juliet as a hegemonistic attempt by Shakespeare to unveil the anti-transvestitism of Elizabethan England, and you've got tenure. The fourth issue is the dominion of therapy. Everything in postmodernism is reduced to the therapeutic. This worldview infects the entire society. It's all about therapy. When truth is denied, all that remains is therapy. The crucial question shifts from what is true to what makes me feel good. Philip Reif, one of the most insightful prophets of our time, described this as the triumph of the therapeutic, and he used a metaphor we can all understand. He said, at every great epic of civilization, there is a form of architecture that symbolizes the age. He said, if you look into times of old, you will see that the most important building was a temple, indicating that the community, the society, saw that as what was most important to worship. He said, even in the medieval era, if you look for the building that would symbolize the entire civilization, it would be the cathedral with its Gothic arches reaching up, testifying to the transcendence of God. He said, in the modern era, the great building that would represent the time would be the United States Capitol building, the place of legislative assembly, the place of democratic deliberation. That would define in so many ways the modern era. But he said, if there's any one building that represents our era now, it is a hospital. Because the only thing we know about ourselves is that we are sick. In the postmodern world, everything is reduced to therapy. And everybody's sick. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the official guideline to all psychiatric and psychological diseases, now includes you and me and all of us. And if we say it doesn't, that's just another disease you'll find in there. Everyone's either in therapy or in denial. And the specific form of denial, it's a new disease all the time. I was reading on the airplane yesterday a serious article about pseudo-attention deficit syndrome. There are people who think they have ADD or ADHD or ASPCA or whatever, but really don't have it, but they've convinced themselves that they do have it. And soon there will be some kind of illness in the DSM for pseudo-attention deficit disorder. It's inevitable. Fifth, the decline of authority. Now this really follows, and you think about logical progression. If the text is robbed of its authority, the author of the text is robbed of its authority. It's the whole issue of authority. It's the root meaning of the word authority. Since postmodern culture is committed to a radical vision of liberation, all authorities must be overthrown. Among the dethroned authorities are texts, authors, traditions, meta-narratives, the Bible, God, and all powers on heaven in heaven and on earth. I know this is generational. But one of the great philosophers of our time, Archie Bunker, once said to Meathead, "Why is it that all you nonconformists dress alike?" And one of the problems with anarchist groups is that they all need leaders. The decline of authority runs against the grain of human existence, and that's what's interesting. We've now reached the point in postmodernism where they say, well, okay, you can't do without all authority, because after all, we have to decide who gets tenure. So we just have to make sure it's the right kind of authority. It's a liberationist authority. It's an authority committed to a certain worldview. It's the kind of issue that comes down when you have a Supreme Court nominee. This last time, interesting discussion, I won't name names, but prominent United States senator said, "I will not settle for anyone to sit in that seat who is not committed to a progressive understanding of the unfolding of human rights in our times." And again, what they're doing is they're deconstructing authority, but they're actually not deconstructing all authority. They're just stipulating what kind of authority they will accept. They're not going to accept an authority, for instance, that dictates sex lives. Rules about sex, rules about issues that the postmodern world is convinced are absolutely personal and off limits. Next, the displacement of morality. If you do deconstruct truth, if you are successful in your worldview in creating a system in which truth is made relative, in which authority is overthrown, in which the text is dead, and thus all morality is relative, you're left with a situation of near total anarchy. Morality is, after all, one of the fundaments of culture. But in the postmodern world, it's discarded as oppressive and totalitarian. A pervasive moral relativism marks postmodern culture. Now, that's not to say that the postmodernists eschew all moral language. They use moral language, but it's the moral language that they champion, which is, again, liberation from oppression. The only morality that the hardline postmodernists will recognize is the morality of absolute liberation from oppression. Someone wants to find modernity as rationalized sexual misbehavior. In many ways, that's absolutely true. One of the things that would be fascinating to trace would be the actual lives of these postmodern theorists. Michael Foucault, one of the men I mentioned, perhaps the most influential postmodernist in American academic circles, especially during the 1990s, died of AIDS. One of the absolute principles of his morality was what he called polymorphous perversity, picking up from Freud, and what he called the absolute mandate of transgression. You have to transgress moral norms in order to prove that they are false moral norms. And he got involved in the worst and most grotesque and unthinkable forms of homosexual misbehavior and died of AIDS. Postmodernism in the society. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that hardline, absolute, uncut, postmodern theory is not something you're likely to encounter in your 15-year-old. It really is more or less isolated in the academy and in the intellectual elites. But here's the bad news. It is filtering down. It's filtering down not in the hardline form. There aren't very many people sitting at the dinner table quoting Derrida and Lyotard and Foucault, but their ideas are filtering down throughout the entire society and the civilization around us. I just want to mention some signs of this. In the academy, we have the absolute reign of theory. The filter down process comes when the academic elites exert their influence on the formative institutions of the culture. And let's just speak about what those are: the cinema, movies, architecture, art, entertainment, and of course, education and the professions. What about art? Well, art was one of the first places that postmodernism showed up. It was one of the first places where the label was actually attached to something. Modernism, you will remember, was associated with people like, for instance, Picasso. Modernism was an attempt, or Paul Klee, it was an attempt to take an absolute posture of rebellion against Christianity, against the established order, against monarchy, against what was understood as pre-modern. And so the modernist artists used cubes and dark hues and sometimes very jarring images in order to make their point. Picasso's painting Guernica, about an atrocity during the Spanish Civil War, may be the most famous modernist painting. But you know what? You look at that painting and you can still recognize, even in Picasso's style, that this picture is telling a story. You can still see a man, his arms outstretched as he's about to be executed by a firing squad. You can still understand that picture. It is a subversive picture. It was intended to subvert the authority of the establishment, the authority, indeed, of the Roman Catholic Church. But it's still telling a story, and you can still understand that story. Postmodern art is not telling a story. It's not intended to be viewed in order to enter into a narrative or to enter into the understanding of what the author intended, the artist intended. Instead, it is intended to be jarring. It is intended to be disassociative. That's one of their favorite words, which means you have no ability to connect the parts because the artist actually didn't connect the parts. Postmodernist art doesn't have meaning. It just makes suggestion. And you see this. You walk in art galleries, and if you haven't done this, let me just suggest a great missiological opportunity is to go into some of the great art galleries, and especially go into the art galleries where they're selling stuff, not just showing it. Go into the premier art galleries in Manhattan and look around, and you will see the most amazing thing. You'll see people staring at pieces of canvas and at artifacts and suggesting how transgressive it is. And oftentimes, transgressive is the only word that would come to mind. Sexual organs, atrocity, just excrement, all celebrated as art. It shows up in the theater, where plays have no point and have no meaning. There's no conclusion. The characters are not even speaking to one another. It's like a Harold Pinter play in which everyone just shows up on one stage. The cinema, this is also a place where postmodernism began first to show itself. People began looking at films and asking the question, what's the point? Well, there wasn't a point. There isn't a point. Now, here's good news and bad news. The good news is that most of the films that are, again, pretty much uncut postmodernism, you're never going to see. They're never going to make it down to your neighborhood cinema. They're going to be in the art houses, and they're going to be shown on the university campuses. But the bad news is that if you want to be a producer or a director that gets attention with the artistic community, you've got to import this kind of thing. And what you must see as your mission is to subvert. The director of Brokeback Mountain said his purpose in making the film was to subvert. And of course, that was apparent in the telling of the story. You have art and cinema, theater, visual art and sculpture. I mean, just go in our nation's capital, and you'll see the transition from traditional art to postmodern art. You go to some of these things and you look at them and you say, this means nothing. And the art community says, exactly. It's worth $4 million. Because this man is, or this woman, or this artist is the absolute representative of postmodern art. One of the hallmarks of postmodern art is what is called pastiche. It's a French word which means you paste things together. And you know, that's understandable if you're 5. But postmodernism basically makes every artist, the 5-year-old is actually the quintessential artist. We're living in very, very strange times. Photography. If you ever want a very interesting exercise, go to a good library, especially a big university library, and look at the English edition of the Soviet Encyclopedia. It goes by different titles because they're always coming out with a new one. So there's the Soviet Encyclopedia, then there's the New Soviet Encyclopedia, then there's the updated New Soviet Encyclopedia. There are no more Soviet encyclopedias. But the reason you want to look at it is for the pictures. Just look at the photographs. And you'll notice between successive editions, people appear and disappear in the photographs. It's really pretty crude stuff. But when you became a non-person in the Soviet Union, you had to have your picture excised from the encyclopedia. And that's rather awkward if your picture is shaking Stalin's hand. And you know, these Soviet photo retouchers weren't too good at it. My favorite one is one that I actually photocopied because it's just perfect. There's a hand in the picture that's not connected to a person. They're having one of these great Soviet multiple handshakes, and there are more hands than there are people. And you look at that and you say, well, we can recognize that this photographer and this retoucher, this publisher, this Soviet agent in charge of this has taken someone out. Well, you see, with photography now, you don't have to take someone out so crudely. In postmodern photography, you're not attempting to tell through representational film what happened. You're now seeking to make a statement about what is possible. And so postmodern photography is another one of these things that, again, is supposed to transgress. And it can be done with such manipulation, especially in a digital age, that it can make things appear as if they are real when we know that they are not. We can make things happen so that it appears someone is present when they are actually absent, or absent when they are present. We can change the scenery. We can change the perspective. And all that plays into the very field of postmodern art. In music, postmodernism is filtered down, especially through the atonality of postmodern music, through composers such as Philip Glass. Daniel Albright describes, you're going to love this, describes postmodern music as marked by three things. You're going to love this: bricolage, polystylism, and randomness. Now, bricolage is like pastiche. It just means you add all the stuff in. It means you no longer have to play by the rules. You can take a little bit of classical, you can take a little bit of Baroque, you can take a little bit of this, and by the way, there's not too much classical or Baroque they add in, but you can take a little of this and a little of that. You can add it all together, and you have the postmodern symphony, which is made only more perfect if you can add a bellowing cow or something like that that's supposed to be disjarring again in order to make the postmodern point. In literature, the novel has been completely transformed. Literature has been nearly completely transformed by the postmodern turn. Just look at the shift from someone like Dostoevsky to Philip Roth. Just look at the postmodern writers and narrativists of our time who write stories that have no particular meaning except to subvert the existing morality, except to subvert the claim that there is a meta-narrative, except to subvert the idea that there is meaning in life, except to subvert the idea that there's anything more transcendent than sex. Modernist literature, that which is before whatever postmodernism comes, was a literature that specifically sought to subvert Victorian values and Victorian morality. And so you had figures such as, well, Virginia Woolf being the great example. And by the way, if someone asks who's afraid of Virginia Woolf, you should say, I am. We as Christians should be very concerned about that worldview, because it was a worldview written, as A.N. Wilson, the historian, says, after God's funeral. It was after the intellectual elites in Britain had lost confidence in the very existence of God, and thus they saw morality as now, again, a form of oppression. They saw Victorian morality. They saw conventional Christian morality as something to be subverted, and so they sought intentionally to do that through the storyline of their characters. But in a postmodern novel, you don't even have to directly subvert it. And there's no particular storyline that necessarily matters. And at the end of the great modernist novel, there was either an absolute reconciliation or a suicide. But in the end of the postmodern novel, there's nothing but sheer confusion, anarchy, and despair. Nothing good is resolved. Nothing either comes to an absolute conclusion of good or of evil. And thus the postmodern novel. The other thing that marks postmodern literature is playing with language. Because the language itself is understood as oppressive. And so you play with language, and you use a lot of hyphens. You start putting hyphens in words, and you start putting words together with hyphens, and before long, you begin to sound like a postmodern theorist in the academy. You just put all this stuff together. You play with words. You have disjunctive conversations. You have characters that aren't even talking to each other. Thus the postmodern novel. One of my favorite places to show the impact of postmodernism is in architecture. because this is something more people perhaps can understand. Postmodern architecture is often very attractive to people. They like it. They often confuse it with something else. Postmodern architecture is just like the music. You remember bricolage? You just add everything together. Polystylism, you mix all the styles. You remember what they said about postmodern art, visual art, pastiche? You just paste it all together. Well, welcome to our world. Welcome to what's going on in modern architecture. Look at what is happening. The first great postmodernist building in the United States was probably the AT&T building in Manhattan, designed by Philip Johnson of Johnson Berge and Associates. That firm was known for modernist architecture. In the midpoint of the 20th century, if you wanted to build a great modernist building, these great steel and glass towers, you called Johnson Berge and Associates. But they developed this building. Philip Johnson developed this AT&T building in 1986 in New York City. 1984 it was started, 1986 it was completed. It's a great modernist tower until you get to the top. Some of you have no doubt seen it. And at the top he put a Chippendale crown. Now it's very interesting. In other words, you have this great steel, concrete, and glass tower, nearly 100 stories tall, and at the very top you have a cornice, a Chippendale artifact. It just looks like it was kind of placed there, like it started out being a building and ended up being a grandfather clock. And people started looking at it and going, that is absolutely phenomenal. That's amazing. Who would have thought of putting that at the top? Of course, most people in the beginning were going, yeah, who would have thought? But what happens in the art world is when people coalesce around the idea that this is the trend, all of a sudden they go from who would have thought to who would have thought? This is genius. This is sheer genius at work. And so you ended up with all of this. Michael Graves, the next great postmodernist architect, began building buildings like the Seattle Public Library and the Humana headquarters and other buildings. And he would build one side of the building in classical architecture, another side of the building in modernist architecture, another side of the building, until you walk around and you realize this building isn't a thing. It's all kinds of things. Perhaps you've landed at an airport or you've been in a great public building and you walk in and here's a Corinthian column standing all by itself, looking rather lonely. We're not in Corinth. There is no structure. There's no portico. It's not accompanied by other Corinthian columns, and it doesn't look like a Greek ruin. And then right next to the Corinthian column is a great concrete red ball. Didn't look like a child left it. This would weigh several tons. It's just sitting there by the Corinthian column. Then you notice that the building isn't straight. The building is leaning. And you notice that it's leaning on one side in this direction, and on the other side it's leaning in another direction. And then you go into the foyer of the building, and there's a piece of Greek statuary from Athens in the 2nd century BC. And you look at that and you say, well, what does that have to do with this? And then on the wall, there's a modernist painting, and then there's a waterfall. You notice there's running under your feet because you're actually standing on glass. There's water running underneath. Let's just add everything. Robert Venturi, one of the great postmodernists, I say great in terms of influential postmodernist architects, had the motto, less is bore. Less is bore. Let's just add everything. You can break all the conventions. You can throw away the 7 books of architecture of ancient Rome. You can throw away the guidebooks of Palladio. You can do away with all of this and just have everything all at once. One of the reasons why I like to point to architecture is because architecture demonstrates where postmodernism shows up, and it also demonstrates conclusively where postmodernism is a lie. Because everybody building one of these major buildings wants a postmodern architect, but follow me closely. No one wants a postmodern engineer. You see, you want absolute truth when you get to engineering. You want somebody who's able to add and use a slide rule. You want somebody with thick glasses and a pocket protector who believes in absolute truth. You want them working the numbers. You want them coming up with the lines. You want all this happening. Why? Because you don't want it to come down on your head. Because you can lie with the way the building looks, but you can't lie with whether or not it stands up. About 3 years ago, a major terminal building at Orly Airport in Paris fell. You know why it fell? And it fell and it killed some people when it fell. You know why it fell? Because a postmodern architect didn't like where the engineers wanted to put a column. So he removed it. Well, guess what? Gravity is a very determined opponent of postmodernism. Gravity exists in order to prove the imbecility of postmodern architecture. Gravity says you can tilt your building, but you better have a counterweight on the other side, or you're going to be looking at a lot of pavement real quick. You see, the lie of postmodernism is that you can't consistently apply its understanding of truth. You can't possibly do this. No one wants a postmodern cardiologist. You know, with postmodern art, you kind of hold it up and you can move it this way or that way, and all you do is multiply the possibilities of interpretation. But you don't want your cardiologist going, I like the x-ray this way. You know, you read the CAT scan to say 4 blockages. I read it to say heart of a 15-year-old runner. We don't want that. No one wants a postmodern banker. No one wants a banker who said, hey, you know, you think 2 + 2 = 4, but that's hegemonistic. I'm not going to play that totalitarian game. We've been oppressing people for too long with that kind of math. From now on, in my bank, when it's your money, 2 + 2 = 3. The hypocrisy of postmodernism shows up with the fact that postmodern theorists can't live with their theories. In the academy, postmodernism, of course, has had far more to do with the soft disciplines than with what are characterized as the hard disciplines. Far more to do with the humanities than with physics. Alan Sokal, a few years ago, a physics professor at New York University, decided he would do a little experiment. And so he wrote an article filled with abject nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It now goes down in history of academic life in America as the Great Sokal Hoax. He wrote an article filled with such nonsense, as in his words, he said, liberally salted with nonsense. He sent it to the postmodern journal published by Duke University known as Social Text. The title of his article, you're going to love this, is Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transgressive Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Let me just tell you, it doesn't mean anything. There is no such thing as quantum gravity. But the people at Social Text did not know that. He wrote thousands of words on transgressing the boundaries through a hermeneutics of quantum gravity. He demonstrated that a hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is everything, interpretation becomes everything. When the text is dead, you're left with nothing but hermeneutics, the process of interpretation. And he toppled democracy, he overthrew morality, he led to a complete political and social revolution in his article about transgressing hermeneutics, or transgressing the boundaries through a hermeneutics of quantum gravity. And then after the article was published, he wrote an open letter to the Academy to the effect that he wrote nonsense. He said, I'm a physicist. I know nonsense when I see it. More importantly, I know nonsense when I write it. And you know what the great moral debate was in the Academy? It wasn't over whether or not there was any consistent view of truth here. It wasn't over whether or not the editors of an academic journal, peer-reviewed academic journal, should have considered whether there was even any validity to this postmodern mash. It was over the fact that he subverted subversion by writing the article and getting it published. I think we need to come up with a brand new slogan. In fact, I think actually Ligonier Ministries pretty much lives up to this slogan, subverting subversion to the glory of God. We need to be about that. Postmodernism comes down to the Academy in the form of the curriculum. Just look at the curriculum, look at the growth in the curriculum. You know the fastest growing part of the curriculum of the American University? It's in sex and gender studies. You will not find this at Harvard in 1641. You will not find it at Harvard in 1941. You will not even find it at Harvard in 1981. But by 1991, everything has changed. Postmodernism brings in the idea that even physicality, even gender, even the understanding of sex and all the rest becomes one of the major issues of oppression, and thus the goal of every right-minded institution of progressive intellectual power and commitment is to deconstruct these truth claims. And again, you look at these departments, and I can't even mention to you, I could not possibly from this place read to you the course titles that you encounter in the American University catalog. Everything comes down to sex, and it all has to be now more and more complex. You can't have an office in your university of gay advocacy or homosexual advocacy. Now it has to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, transgendered, bisexual, whatever comes after that. You have to leave space on your door or additional words to be added later because there are no boundaries. If you transgress, you're committed to transgression. If that's your mode of life, there are no outer limits. Well, what about the students? Campus life comes down to this. New York Times article last Sunday on the fact that the fastest growing form of publication on the university campus is the Sex magazine. And they're produced by students, written by students. Yale University used to get into controversy with what is known as Sex Week. The campus given over to sexual experimentation in ways that, again, could never be mentioned here, with the support of the university and with funding from its student activities budget. But it's really not even a matter of controversy anymore. Postmodernism comes down to this: you must transgress all boundaries. While we're in the university, we should talk about law. Postmodernism has infected legal studies. It specifically is now known as critical legal theory. And critical legal theory, just like all other forms of postmodernism, suggests that what must be done is the deconstruction of existing authorities, the law being an authority, the courts being an authority, legislators and governments being an authority, police officers being an authority. We must subvert all of this through critical legal theory. Again, the fastest growing movement in law schools in America. But it all is tied to that overarching worldview. For instance, the demise of the text. One of the texts that now is nothing but matter for interpretation is the U.S. Constitution. And the roots of a postmodern interpretation of the U.S. Constitution go all the way back to the 1960s and perhaps was best articulated by Associate Justice William O. Douglas. When dealing with a case on the 14th Amendment, he found that the 14th Amendment actually didn't speak to the issue of his concern, so instead he said that he would rule this way, claiming now get this, a penumbra of rights found within the 14th Amendment. Now, the interesting thing is that the word penumbra, until William O. Douglas used it in the Supreme Court opinion, it had to do with astronomy, not law. But nonetheless, he picked it up, and now it is the goal of every professor in a postmodern law school to find a right that hasn't been found in that penumbra of rights before. And you see the logic of what's going on. You take the debate over abortion in America, and you take even the debate that is very current in our society over same-sex marriage. And what you hear, especially on the abortion debate, is this: you can't take back a right. You just follow that logic. That, again, falls right into critical legal theory. In other words, the right wasn't there. No one with a straight face believes that the framers of the U.S. Constitution meant to put it there, but it was found there, articulated by Justice Blackmun in 1973 in the Roe v. Wade decision. And once that right has been found, it can never be forfeited. Why? Because that will be sheer oppression. If you don't understand that logic, you don't understand the cultural cleavage in this country. You don't understand why the people teaching in the law schools in America do not understand who we are, why we believe as we do, and think as we do. We must be interested in how they think, even if they are uninterested in how we think. The breakdown of a shared consensus means that even as the breakdown of morality and social convention leaves nothing but therapy, the breakdown of a legal consensus leaves nothing but litigation. The litigation explosion in this country is almost entirely traced to the fact that this society has subverted the moral norms that would have led to the resolution of these claims before they ever would get to court, or the social conventions that would have led to the resolution of these claims, or the social institutions that would have aided the resolution of these claims before they ever would get to the court. Now, everything is litigation. In politics, we no longer expect to deal with what is real, We no longer expect that the candidates are being presented to us as who they really are. We understand that there is now such a process of marketing and packaging, and there's such a reality of research and polling and of word massaging and all the rest. We no longer expect that we're actually dealing with a candidate and his character. This leads to disillusionment in the political sphere, and again, it leads to nothing more than the breakdown of the larger society. In business, postmodernism has also entered, but again, it doesn't enter in the contract level and it doesn't enter in the transaction level. In business, it's more about marketing. And in our consumer society, business has caught on to the fact that one of the appetites of a postmodern age is for needs that were never known to be needs before. And so we now fuel these creation of needs the way we fuel the creation of rights. And now every kid needs an iPod and a cell phone. Whereas most children throughout human history managed to reach adulthood without an iPod and a cell phone. It's almost impossible to believe that it could happen now because we need this. A study was done by Marketing Age just last week indicating that Americans are absolutely certain that among the basic needs for human existence are a dishwasher, a washing machine, a television, and a personal computer. That's base level human existence. Can't possibly live without those things. Would know what to do without those things, having never met the modernist artifact of running water in a sink and the pre-modern artifacts of a rock and running water. This is now a need. We create needs the way we create rights. The impact on the family of this postmodern shift is absolutely huge. The family has been shorn of its authority, shorn of its functions. The government has now stepped in. Christopher Lasch, a late theorist, demonstrated this perhaps more prophetically than anyone else. The family has been stripped naked by the society. The father has been robbed of his authority. Why? Because we have to overthrow the totalitarian oppression of patriarchy. The parents have been robbed of their authority writ large across the culture because, after all, who are they to say how their children should live? Remember that one of the big movements in the 1970s was children's rights litigation. It hasn't disappeared. It has just gone into the larger sea of critical legal theory, and it is coming out in court cases all over the place. The family has been shorn of its educational role as the state has come in to take on the role of teacher. The family has been shorn of its culture-shaping role as other institutions come in to teach children how they should be good citizens. The family has been stripped of its spiritual role. We see the debris of all of this. What does it mean that in Manhattan public schools right now, 6 out of 10 boys are on Ritalin? Something's gone desperately wrong with a society that medicates boys, in most cases, for being boys. But of course, we couldn't even have this discussion because that, too, is a misconstrual of gender, which is an entirely social constructed concept. And thus you see common sense denied. I mean, such things as articles demonstrating that boys learn better in the company of single-sex education, and yet you have people come back and saying that can't be true. And not only can it not be true, but it is unfair to girls that they can't be a part of the boys improving. And the fact that the boys are now outnumbered on college campuses by girls. And it's not that there are just more women going to college, it's that there are fewer men in absolute numbers right now going to 4-year college than 20 years ago. And we can't even have a rational discussion about why it would be so. We look at family breakdown in America, we can't even have a rational discussion of why it might be so. We look at the phenomenon of AIDS, and we can't even have a rational discussion of why it is so. I mentioned subverting subversion as one of the Christian responsibilities of our time, and I believe that with all of my heart. And I believe that the time is short because the reality is that this filtered down process is affecting our children. They're watching the movies, they're seeing the advertising. So many of them are in schools where this kind of postmodern worldview is being basically mainlined into them almost as if it's an IV going right into their bodies. They're getting this from the culture, they're getting it from the music, they're getting it from their peers. James Davison Hunter, now 15 years ago, wrote an amazing book in which he indicated that evangelical young people, and these would now be in their early 30s, were in terms of belief system radically different than their parents without their parents recognizing it. If that was true 15 years ago, I would suggest to you it is far more true and far more urgently and emphatically important than even then. It's important that we understand postmodernism, and frankly, it's important that we understand postmodernism in its uncut form in the academy, because if you don't understand the source, you can't possibly understand the fountain. But we need to be people who, with keen eyes and with an apologetic sense of mission, can look at the world and say, I know where that comes from. And we need to be the kind of people who, in evangelistic conversation with our neighbors, understand when they talk about morality is oppressive and they start using this language, we know where it comes from. One of the most important things we can do is show an honest postmodernist where postmodernism lands with a thud. Again, you can have a postmodern architect, but not a postmodern engineer. You can have a postmodern artist, but you don't want a postmodern banker. And as Richard Rorty, himself a postmodern theorist, said, I'm a modernist at 33,000 feet. You want a pilot who believes in absolute truth and rationality and order and predictability. It's a great apologetic challenge to live in the time the Lord has given us. It's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to subvert subversion to the glory of God, to help people see where postmodernism shapes the culture and where postmodernism collapses upon itself. Sometimes one of the most important ministries of the Christian is to stand amidst the debris, point to the cause of the fall, and to the only hope for recovery. That's what we hear about. It's the very heart of Christian apologetics. Let's tell the truth to the glory of God. God bless you.